My name is Elias and I am 34 years old. For 7 long years, I kept the clinic books clean. Lyle leaned against the counter and looked down at my ledger. You are just a glorified pill counter with a fancy diploma, he said. I did not blink. I simply closed the heavy old leather binder and locked it away in the small safety deposit box bolted beneath the floor. The clinic smelled of cold antiseptic and old paper. Animals came through our doors every single day. Someone had to record the exact doses and the precise times. Lyle never cared about the treatment charts. He only cared about the bottom line at the end of the month. You worry too much about our profit margins, he said. I stared at the green ink drying on the page. Every receipt told a story. The system was designed to hide the gaps. I knew where every single pill went. None of it mattered to me yet. I just kept writing down the figures. You should stay for what comes next in this cold clinic. Subscribe to find out what rested inside that safety deposit box bolted securely beneath the floorboards. This is a deliberate settling of accounts, never a loud argument in a crowded room. Leave a comment and share your city with me today. I kept the records precise. All records contributed to the ending total, since Lyle focused exclusively on profit margins, whereas I tracked each individual pill. Every morning at the clinic began with the blue ledger. I opened the heavy cover and checked the columns. The numbers told a quiet story of the building. Animals cannot speak to explain their pain. They leave only the physical trace behind. We learned to read those biological receipts. Every dose of medicine leaves a footprint in the ink. Lyle preferred to stare at the wall calendar and guess at future profits while the morning frost melted on the glass. I preferred the small certainty of 48 milligrams accounted for down to the final drop. My grandmother Clara taught me this habit long ago in her kitchen. She always said a ledger never forgets what a person tries to overlook. We watched the stray dogs come and go through the metal doors. Each patient required careful tracking from intake to discharge. You trace the fever backward to find the infection. You follow the paper trail to see where the resources went. The clinic was quiet before the afternoon appointments arrived. I kept my pencil sharp and my thoughts entirely to myself while the heavy winter wind rattled the loose window panes upstairs. The blue ledger remained open on the metal table. Winter light fell across 24 lines of inventory. Every pill counted, every bottle accounted for. My grandmother Clara believed in a specific order of things. She repeated her doctrine whenever someone questioned the medicine drawer. In the Vance household, what was provided for the vulnerable was claimed as a personal sacrifice by whoever held the keys to the dispensary. She said those exact words every single Sunday morning. Lyle inherited that belief without ever reading a single treatment chart. He believed holding the keys meant owning the effort behind the medicine. The system ran on this unspoken understanding every single day. Clara walked into the treatment room with a heavy ceramic mug. Steam rose into the cold air. She set the mug down beside the blue ledger. Her fingers were spotted with age. She looked at the rows of numbers I had written in green ink. You spend too much time worrying about the small margins, Clara said, leaning against the cold counter. She pulled her wool cardigan tighter around her narrow shoulders. Lyle is right about the bigger picture, Elias. He knows how the world works around here. I kept my pen resting against the paper. The clinic doors rattled as the winter wind pushed against the metal hinges. I did not argue with her about the philosophy. Arguing required a shared language that simply did not exist between us. Clara lived by the family law she had practiced for decades. Whoever handed out the medicine owned the gratitude of whoever received it. The animals did not care about personal sacrifices or family traditions. They only cared about relief from pain. Their treatment charts showed the plain truth of their recovery without any emotional distortion. Lyle walked through the metal doors a moment later. He shook snow from his heavy canvas jacket. He tossed a set of brass keys onto the desk. They landed right on top of my careful totals. You are making things complicated again, Lyle said, wiping his wet boots on the rubber mat. We have bills to pay and margins to protect. He believed his presence alone constituted the entire operation of the clinic. The family rule justified every action he took. It gave him permission to overlook the smaller details of administration. I reached out and picked up the keys. The metal felt cold against my palm. Clara watched us both with tired eyes from the corner. She took a slow sip from her ceramic mug. The rules of the house governed every interaction under this roof. Every transaction carried an invisible tax paid in emotional debt. Lyle assumed I would simply accept this framework forever. He did not understand the purpose of a ledger. A book does not care about family rules or personal sacrifices. It only records what actually happened during the working day. Grandmother Clara sat at the wooden table in the back room. She was 72 years old, and her hands shook slightly against the surface. She held a small yellowed piece of paper between her frail fingers. It was our mother's recipe card, saved from another kitchen years ago. She smoothed the worn corner with her thumb. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the ancient appliance near the door. Lyle walked into the cramped room without knocking. He stood by the counter and tapped his fingers against the laminate surface. He was 36 and moved with a restless energy that filled the space. Some animals are just naturally high-strung, Elias, he said, nodding toward the ledger on the shelf. They burn through their reserves faster than you give them. I looked up from the treatment chart resting in my hands. The paper was crisp and marked with exact tallies of every single pill dispensed that week. Clara nodded along with his casual words. She always defended him when the numbers grew tangled in the quarterly reports. She believed in the family rule of personal sacrifice above all else. She looked at me with tired eyes and waited for my agreement. I said nothing to challenge his claim about the animals in our care. My silence was a tool I practiced every single day. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the small steel key there. It opened the safety deposit box, which was always locked tightly, bolted securely beneath the floorboards in the adjacent room. That box held my private leather ledger and every single duplicate receipt. Lyle poured himself a cup of lukewarm water from the metal tap. He checked his watch and complained about the clinic overhead costs. He believed everything belonged to whoever held the dispensary keys at any given time. Clara took a sip from her ceramic mug and agreed with him quietly. She had given up her own share of authority decades ago just to keep the peace. I watched the way they shared that narrow kitchen space together. They looked like two people acting out a script written long before I was born. Every calculation had to balance out eventually in the real world. A treatment chart told one story, while their voices told another entirely different tale. I closed the folder slowly and set it flat against the grain of the wood. We sat there in the fading afternoon light for a long time. The shadows stretched across the worn floorboards toward the heavy metal door. Lyle finished his water and dropped the plastic cup into the wire bin. He left the room without glancing at the records I had spent hours verifying. Clara stayed behind at the table with her memories and her heavy silence. I remained at the table after he left the room. My thoughts drifted back to the inventory cabinets and the missing 48 milligrams of medicine. Clara reached out and touched my sleeve with a thin, trembling hand. She told me to let the small discrepancies go away quietly before they caused trouble. I nodded once and kept my own counsel locked away safely. The responsibility for keeping Astoria Clinic honest fell entirely on my shoulders alone. Nobody else cared about the exact totals or the missing entries in the log. I walked back down the hall toward the main treatment room. The antiseptic smell hung heavy in the cold air around the stainless steel tables. I opened the heavy ledger and picked up my green pen once more. Every entry, written carefully in green ink, mattered more than anyone else understood. The final reconciliation report would require absolute precision when the quarter ended. I closed the cover with a soft click that echoed in the empty room. My work was quiet and methodical and entirely separate from their noise. The heavy metal door stayed ajar. Cold air swept across the linoleum floor. Lyle stood by the stainless steel counter with his hands resting flat on the surface. He looked down at the open blue ledger with sharp annoyance. "You are making too much of this small discrepancy," Lyle said. I kept my pen steady against the paper. The figures were missing 5 units from the morning intake log. "Those numbers are just administrative noise in a busy place like this," he said. I did not look up from the blue lines. Every entry mattered for the quarterly audit. Lyle shook his head and laughed softly. "You have always cared more about ink than actual survival," he said. Grandmother Clara walked into the room wearing her heavy wool cardigan. She carried a ceramic mug filled with hot black coffee. "What is the trouble in here this morning?" Clara asked. Lyle pointed a finger at the open pages before me. "Elias refuses to see the broader picture of how this clinic operates," Lyle said. Clara took a slow sip from her mug. She looked down at my green ink with mild disappointment. "We have always trusted you with the administrative side of things," Clara said. Her voice carried the weight of a dozen previous winter mornings. I kept my fingers curled around the wooden pen holder. The ledger page remained clean under the harsh fluorescent light. "Some animals are just naturally high-strung," Elias, Lyle said. "They burn through their reserves faster than you give them." He reached out and tapped the paper with his knuckle. "You cannot log every breath an animal takes inside these walls," he said. I turned the page to check the prior week totals. The columns showed a persistent shortfall that nobody else wanted to acknowledge. I pressed the tip of my pen against the margin. "A body doesn't lie about how it's been treated," I thought to myself while looking at the thin spine of the dog on the table. Lyle crossed his arms over his canvas jacket. "You need to fix these totals before the end of the business day," Lyle said. He turned on his heel and walked toward the front office without waiting for an answer. Clara stayed by the metal table for another long moment. Her eyes traced the columns of numbers in the blue book. "Do not make things harder than they already are for your cousin," Clara said. She set her mug down on the edge of the metal cart. The ceramic clinked sharply against the steel. I did not argue with her about the missing inventory. Arguing required a shared set of facts that we clearly did not possess. Clara turned and followed Lyle out of the back room. The silence returned to the small clinic space immediately. I stared at the blank space at the bottom of the page. Astoria winters were always long, but this one felt colder than usual. I picked up my pen and started drafting the next line of records. The clinic hallway felt narrower now. I walked past the supply room without looking inside. My steps stayed even on the cold tile. A row of empty cages lined the wall near the back sink. I adjusted my grip on the heavy metal clipboard, making sure the blue intake forms remained neatly aligned beneath the silver clip. Lyle stayed in the front office. His ceramic coffee mug sat beside the cash register. I did not go near the desk during the morning shift. The daily clinic logs always required 2 separate signatures for every single scheduled pharmaceutical transfer handled during the busy morning shift. Clara watched me from the kitchen doorway on Maple Street. Her ceramic teacup made a faint sound against the chipped porcelain saucer. I placed my spare keys on the small wooden table by the hall tree. The heavy brass ring stayed completely cold under my palm, while she stood quietly by the pantry waiting for me to speak. I kept my personal receipts elsewhere. The downtown safety deposit box required a small key and a signature. I rented the small metal drawer 3 blocks from the clinic. Nobody ever watched me walk down the narrow concrete stairs to reach the cold steel vault located beneath the Astoria sidewalk. Inside the metal box, I placed duplicate copies of every corrected inventory sheet. The pages stacked neatly against the back wall. No one checked those files. No one at the clinic ever knew the secure drawer existed except for the quiet bank clerk who stamped my annual renewal card. The distance between us grew without a sound. Conversations became brief and functional. We talked about patient weights and temperature logs. Nothing else remained between 2 adult cousins who shared a crowded roof but never looked at the exact same financial ledger. I carried the box key on a separate ring in my coat pocket. It jingled softly against a spare coin. The metal stayed cold against my lining. I walked quietly back toward the main clinic doors long before the heavy afternoon medical rounds finally began for the day. The examination table needed a fresh paper liner. I pulled the white roll down and tore the edge. The metal teeth left a jagged line across the width. I carefully smoothed the clean white surface with my open palm while waiting for the next patient treatment chart to arrive. Lyle walked past the doorway. He glanced at my shoes and kept walking. The silence between us felt solid enough to touch. I checked the small wall thermometer and carefully wrote down 40 degrees in the permanent daily temperature logbook by the sink. Every entry matched the reality of the room. Physiological data provides an honest picture if you pay attention. I closed the binder and placed it back on the shelf. My daily veterinary work here followed its own quiet rhythm without ever needing any outside approval from the front office. The evening air in Astoria turned damp. Streetlights flickered on along Duane Street. I locked the clinic's side door and checked the latch twice. My heavy house keys made almost no sound at all as I slid them deep into the dark lining of my coat pocket. Walking past the brick storefronts helped clear my head. The pavement was slick from a passing mist. I kept my hands inside my sleeves. The small safety deposit box key pressed firmly against my knuckle like a quiet physical reminder of my growing independence. The brick house on Maple Street was dark upstairs. Clara sat reading by a single lamp in the parlor. She did not look up when I stepped through the front entrance. The old wooden floorboards groaned beneath my heavy work boots with a familiar weight that echoed through the empty hallway. I climbed the stairs without turning on the landing light. My bedroom door stood slightly ajar. A single envelope sat on the small oak desk by the window. I did not open it right away this evening because the contents already seemed entirely predictable based on previous notes. The paper was thick and cream-colored. Lyle used stationery from the front desk drawer for his notes. I slid the envelope into my leather bag instead of tearing the flap. The heavy leather bag went straight into the locked iron strongbox that sat tucked away in the back corner of the closet. Morning arrived with the same gray light over the harbor. I dressed in silence and walked the 3 blocks again. The routine offered a steady shield against whatever arguments waited at the end of the hall. No one spoke a single word while I unlocked the rear dispensary door and placed my clipboard on the examination table. My inventory sheets remained exact. Every decimal point stayed in its proper column. The blue ledger stayed on the high shelf across the room where Lyle left it. I calmly reached for my own black ink pen and kept working steadily through the morning patient intake forms without hesitation. Let me stop here and ask you something directly. Have you ever been treated like you did not quite count, like your work was invisible right up until the moment something went wrong? If you have, I would really like to hear about it. Drop a reply below explaining how it went. It helps to know I am not the only one who spent years being underestimated by the people who should have known better. The winter rain hit the glass of the back window while the clinic stayed quiet at 5 in the morning. I pulled out a fresh sheet of heavy paper. Each column required exact numbers. Lyle walked past the door with his heavy boots making a sharp sound on the floor. He dropped a bundle of receipts onto the counter. I did not look up from my work. My pen moved across the page in a steady rhythm. The record grew line by line. Years passed in the narrow rooms of the building, while grandmother Clara walked down the damp hallway less often than before. Her knees troubled her during the damp autumn months. She leaned against the doorframe and watched me work. Her apron pockets held old kitchen receipts and small brass keys. She never mentioned the missing inventory amounts. I dipped my pen into the green ink again. The columns matched the physical stock in the back room with absolute precision. A good veterinarian knows that animals cannot speak for themselves. Lyle spent more time arguing over supply costs in the front office because he hated dealing with actual animal care. He complained about the price of bandages and surgical steel. He signed the quarterly supply orders with hurried strokes of a black ballpoint pen. I recorded every single discrepancy in my private book. 48 milligrams of sedative compounds vanished from the inventory log every 3 months. Nobody else seemed to notice the missing stock. The family habit of looking away remained firmly in place. I closed the leather cover and locked the brass clasp securely. Spring arrived with muddy boots and wet dog hair in the waiting room, while the street outside remained entirely deserted. A brown retriever lay on the examination table with a torn ligament. I checked its heart rate and recorded the vital signs in the daily chart. Lyle stood by the supply cabinet and crossed his arms over his chest. He tapped his foot against the linoleum floor. "We need to cut down on recovery time for these routine cases," he said. I cleaned my stethoscope with an alcohol wipe and placed it back in my pocket. I wrote the medication dosage down in the ledger before answering him because accuracy mattered more than his impatience. Every animal deserved proper care regardless of the ledger totals. Lyle shook his head and walked back toward the front counter. The clinic smelled of wet fur and old disinfectant. I opened the floor safe and slid the new stack of records inside. The metal door clicked shut with a heavy sound. The safety deposit box beneath the floorboards grew heavier with every passing season. Summer brought the heat through the single cracked window in the back office while the flies buzzed near the screen door. I sorted through invoices from the previous 3 years. Every receipt had its duplicate tucked safely behind it. The system remained entirely invisible to anyone else in the building. The evening shift brought 3 stray cats through the side door. I cleaned their deep cuts with sterile gauze and bottled saline. Lyle stood by the counter counting cash from the register drawers. "We need to buy more suture thread next week," he said. I placed the soiled gauze in the red biohazard bin. "I will order it tomorrow," I said. He dropped a handful of copper coins onto the wooden surface. The ringing sound echoed through the empty clinic rooms. Winter arrived again with cold drafts sweeping under the front sill. The wooden desk drawer held 3 full years of duplicate slips and signed manifests. Each slip bore a distinct serial number written carefully in green ink. Clara walked slowly down the hall, with her heavy wool shawl pulled tight against her shoulders. "My joints ache when the bitter frost settles into these old floorboards," she said. I offered her a cup of warm chamomile tea from the small back burner. She took the ceramic mug with trembling fingers. Lyle ignored us both and slammed the supply cabinet door shut with unnecessary force. The inventory sheet showed 48 milligrams of sedative unaccounted for during the prior quarter alone. I wrote the figures down in the private leather book without raising my voice. The binding of the heavy book grew worn at the corners from daily handling. A quiet personal discipline sustained the work through every empty afternoon in Astoria. The numbers never lied about what happened in the dark. Rain drummed steadily against the rusted tin roof above the storage shed outside. I checked the internal temperature inside the refrigerator unit where biological samples rested on glass shelves. Lyle leaned against the hallway doorframe with a paper cup of cold coffee in his hand. "You spend far too much time checking those useless financial columns," he said. I closed the heavy refrigerator door and latched it securely. The small compressor motor hummed softly in the corner of the room. A stray dog barked twice in the alley behind the building. I walked back to the wooden desk without answering his complaint. The green ink dried slowly under the small brass lamp on the corner. Every transaction remained fixed on the heavy paper exactly where it belonged. The safety deposit box waited beneath the floorboards with its brass key hidden safely in my coat pocket. Time moved forward without changing the underlying balance of the accounts or the quiet tension in the building. A veterinarian learns to watch for subtle signs of strain in every living creature that crosses the threshold. Another morning brought gray light through the front windows. I opened the ledger and sharpened the tip of my wooden pen. The clinic smelled faintly of bleach and old dust. Lyle flipped through a stack of pamphlets by the front door. "We have bills to pay before the month ends," he said. I checked the tally on the daily receipt roll and noted the exact sum in the appropriate column. The page turned smoothly under my steady hand. The routine offered a quiet anchor against the mounting uncertainty. The shadows lengthened across the cold linoleum floor as the afternoon waned into evening. Clara returned to her small room down the quiet hall with her shawl draped over her arms. I locked the heavy front door against the coming dusk. Every single record stayed safely in its proper place inside the metal box. The work demanded patience above all else. No hurried gesture could fix a broken ledger or restore a missing item. I closed the wooden desk drawer and turned off the small brass lamp. The night outside remained entirely still. The afternoon sunlight hit the back window of the clinic with a pale, thin glare. Dust motes drifted slowly through the cold air. I stood by the stainless steel sink and scrubbed my hands with antiseptic soap. The bottle made a dry, hollow sound when I pumped it. 48 milligrams of the sedative compound were missing from the log again. Clara sat at the wooden desk near the corner. She held a stack of old invoices in her lap. Her fingers traced the frayed edges of the paper without seeing the numbers printed there. The lie we all maintained in this house was starting to fray at the seams. It was a heavy thing to carry through the narrow hallways every single day. Lyle walked into the room carrying a shivering terrier under his arm. The small dog whimpered softly against his chest. I watched my cousin's face change in the harsh fluorescent light. His shoulders were rounded and tight with exhaustion. He looked down at the animal with a genuine, quiet tenderness that caught me completely off guard. His hands were shaking as he adjusted the wool blanket around the trembling paws. "Some animals are just naturally high-strung, Elias," he said softly, his voice dropping all its usual defensive edge. "They burn through their reserves faster than you give them," he added. I stared at him across the room. For a brief second, he looked less like an adversary and more like a tired man drowning in his own mistakes. He pressed his face against the dog's head. The raw grief in his eyes was entirely real. It made him a person instead of a cartoon villain. I swallowed hard and looked away from the table. The family lie usually demanded that everyone pretend everything was fine. Right now, in this quiet room, the illusion cracked right down the middle. Clara looked up from her stack of papers with cloudy eyes. She did not know what to say to either of us. The silence between us felt different now. It was no longer just an absence of words. It was the heavy weight of a truth waiting to be spoken aloud. I dried my hands on a clean white towel. The fabric felt rough against my skin. Lyle set the terrier down on the examination table with extreme care. He smoothed its fur with a slow, deliberate motion of his thumb. He did not look at me while he worked on the animal. His breath came in ragged, uneven gasps that echoed off the tile walls. I walked over to the metal cabinet and reached for the treatment chart. My fingers brushed the cold surface of the steel handle. The records did not care about human moments or tired excuses. They only tracked what was there and what had vanished into thin air. Every single entry demanded absolute accuracy from us both. Clara cleared her throat and shifted her weight in the wooden chair. The floorboards creaked underneath her worn leather shoes. We had lived under the same roof for years pretending the numbers added up. They did not add up anymore, and everyone could feel it. Lyle rubbed his eyes with the back of his sleeve. He looked older than 36 in the unforgiving afternoon light. Astoria was quiet outside the brick storefronts across the street. A car passed by with a low hum of tires on wet asphalt. I opened the heavy leather ledger on the counter. The green ink stared back at me with unblinking precision. I picked up my pen and waited for the next step. The crack in the foundation was widening by the hour. "We are close now, so let me ask you one more thing before it turns. When you have been pushed as far as I had been, what finally makes a quiet person stop staying quiet? I am asking because I think you already know the answer. If you have felt that line get crossed in your own life, tell me in the comments. Please remain close by, since the upcoming part is the reason I preserved every single document." The printed email chain rested flat against the scarred grain of the kitchen table. Lyle had sent it late Tuesday evening to the entire clinic staff. He thought he was closing every loop before the quarterly audit. He explained his actions with dangerous clarity in those digital paragraphs. Some animals are just naturally high-strung, Elias. They burn through their reserves faster than you give them, he had written. I read those exact lines 3 times to make sure my eyes were not deceiving me. I smoothed the top sheet with my thumb. The paper felt crisp against my callous skin. Lyle trusted his own digital ink entirely too much. He believed written excuses vanished into servers where nobody looked twice. The 48 milligrams of surgical sedative missing from the main cabinet were right there in his text. He listed them as routine waste during minor canine procedures, fabricating treatments that never happened on those dates. My grandmother Clara walked past the open kitchen doorway without stopping. Her apron pocket carried her keys and old recipes. She did not glance at the papers spread before me. I pulled my heavy leather ledger from the floor safe. The green ink columns lined up against Lyle-typed message with brutal exactness. Every date he mentioned on the screen clashed with my handwritten logs from the clinic recovery ward. He walked into the kitchen 5 minutes later holding a ceramic mug. The smell of black coffee drifted ahead of him. You are studying those old reports again, Lyle said, stopping by the counter. I kept my eyes on the ink lines. I am just verifying the totals for the weekly reconciliation, I said. He snorted and set his mug down hard against the Formica top. You waste too much time chasing ghosts in the margins, Lyle said, leaning against the wooden refrigerator door. I turned the printed email toward him so he could read his own words. Those animals must have powerful metabolisms to need 48 milligrams every single week, I said. The color drained from his face instantly. He stared at the page like it had teeth waiting to bite him. The kitchen felt suddenly very quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Lyle reached out a hand to touch the paper. He pulled his fingers back before they made contact. You should not be looking through my messages, Lyle said, his voice dropping an octave. I did not move my hands from the table. The written confession sat between us under the yellow light of the overhead lamp. He had signed his name at the bottom of the printout. The digital signature matched his personnel file in the lower drawer. There was no way for him to claim a clerical error now. The words belonged to him permanently. I picked up my green pen and turned to a fresh page in the master log. My work required patience, not panic, during moments like this one when the truth finally arrived. Outside the window, the evening mist rolled across Maple Street toward the brick houses. Astoria settled into its usual post-sunset stillness. Clara remained upstairs in her small room with her memories and her collection of recipes. I tapped the corner of the printed paper against the wood. Lyle stood frozen by the counter for a long moment before walking away into the dark hallway without another word. The record was complete now. Every single entry had its corresponding proof sitting right beside it in black and white. I closed the heavy leather cover very slowly. The latch clicked shut with a sharp metal sound. I slid both documents inside the shallow metal box bolted beneath the floorboards. The accounting was nearly ready for its final balance after years of silent waiting. The kitchen table held 48 pages of matched records under the harsh overhead light. Grandmother Clara walked into the room with slow steps. She placed a small yellowed paper beside my green ledger. The heavy silence filled the small room while she looked down at the precise columns of numbers. I kept my hands flat against the wooden surface. Lyle stood near the doorway with his arms crossed tightly across his chest. He refused to meet my eyes across the room. I found the discrepancies years ago, she said softly. Her voice sounded thin and tired in the quiet space. You carried the burden alone for 12 years, Lyle muttered from the shadows by the pantry door. I looked down at the mother's recipe card, resting beside the ledger. The ink had faded decades ago. My mother wrote her baking notes in the same careful script I used for the clinic books. A body doesn't lie about how it's been treated, Clara said, using the exact words she always avoided. She reached out with a trembling hand and touched the edge of the printed email chain. She did not try to excuse the missing 48 milligrams of surgical sedative. She simply acknowledged the record. This ledger is complete, I said. The morning light began to filter through the small window above the sink. Lyle shifted his weight from one foot to the other without speaking another word. Clara pushed the yellowed recipe card slightly closer to my green book. I opened the safety deposit box key on the table. The metal gleamed under the bulb. Lyle watched the small movement with pale skin and tight shoulders. The records matched every single entry from the past 12 years. No numbers were missing from the sequence. Every patient treatment chart accounted for the exact dosage dispensed during the morning shifts. I turned the page slowly to the final summary. The totals balanced perfectly down to the last decimal point. Lyle stared at the green ink without offering a single excuse for his actions. Clara sat down on the wooden chair by the window. She folded her hands neatly in her lap and waited for what came next. The kitchen table held 48 pages of matched records under the harsh overhead light. Grandmother Clara walked into the room with slow steps. She placed a small yellowed paper beside my green ledger. The heavy silence filled the small room while she looked down at the precise columns of numbers. I kept my hands flat against the wooden surface. Lyle stood near the doorway with his arms crossed tightly across his chest. He refused to meet my eyes across the room. "I found the discrepancies years ago," she said softly. Her voice sounded thin and tired in the quiet space. "You carried the burden alone for 12 years, Lyle muttered from the shadows by the pantry door. I looked down at the mother's recipe card resting beside the ledger. The ink had faded decades ago. My mother wrote her baking notes in the same careful script I used for the clinic books. "A body doesn't lie about how it's been treated," Clara said, using the exact words she always avoided. She reached out with a trembling hand and touched the edge of the printed email chain. She did not try to excuse the missing 48 milligrams of surgical sedative. She simply acknowledged the record. "This ledger is complete," I said. The morning light began to filter through the small window above the sink. Lyle shifted his weight from one foot to the other without speaking another word. Clara pushed the yellowed recipe cards slightly closer to my green book. I opened the safety deposit box key on the table. The metal gleamed under the bulb. Lyle watched the small movement with pale skin and tight shoulders. The records matched every single entry from the past 12 years. No numbers were missing from the sequence. Every patient treatment chart accounted for the exact dosage dispensed during the morning shifts. I turned the page slowly to the final summary. The totals balanced perfectly down to the last decimal point. Lyle stared at the green ink without offering a single excuse for his actions. Clara sat down on the wooden chair by the window. She folded her hands neatly in her lap and waited for what came next. Lyle shifted his weight again. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots. "These records belonged to the clinic long before either of us walked these halls," I said quietly, keeping my tone level. Clara nodded from her wooden chair. She pulled out a small brass key. She placed the key beside the mother's recipe card. "You always kept better track of the daily numbers than your cousin ever did," Clara said, her voice dry and steady. Lyle stared at the small metal object with a dark expression. He knew precisely what the key unlocked. I did not say anything else to break the silence. The morning sun climbed higher over Astoria. The accumulated weight of 12 years of careful daily documentation filled the small kitchen room with an absolute and undeniable authority. "We are finished here for today," I said, looking directly at Lyle. He walked out the back door without offering another word. Clara remained seated quietly by the sunny window, while her fragile hands rested peacefully upon the stained wooden table surface. I left the heavy ledger on the counter. Nothing more needed to be explained between us today. We had the absolute truth written down in permanent green ink. Lyle stared at the open binding. His hands rested flat on the laminate counter. He expected a devastating public spectacle that would strip him of his entire livelihood and leave him with nothing left. I closed the heavy leather cover instead. The green ink remained our private secret. I did not pick up the telephone. I did not dial the district office. The temptation of absolute power sat right there on the wood. I could have ruined him with a single signature before the clock struck noon. I chose a different path entirely because holding on to that kind of bitterness was a poor companion for a working veterinarian. I slid the ledger back into the metal box beneath the floorboards. Lyle looked up from his scuffed boots. "You are not going to tell Clara," he said, his voice barely carrying across the room. I locked the brass latch with a quiet click and looked right into his pale eyes without a trace of satisfaction. "I am not telling anyone," I said. "Some men lived for the destruction of their bitterest enemies. I lived for the quiet maintenance of the truth. The animals in the recovery ward needed my full attention long before the afternoon rounds began across the cold clinic." Lyle remained standing by the sink like a frightened ghost. He could not understand my strange restraint. He expected blood and fire because that was how he operated. I walked slowly toward the cold hallway without offering another single word to punctuate the end of our 12-year dispute. The linoleum felt cold beneath my work boots. I did not need to break him to know my records were correct. The heavy green ledgers spoke clearly for themselves without requiring any added shouting from either side of the fractured family. The practice continued under the exact same roof. Nothing changed on the surface of our daily routine. Lyle carefully avoided my direct gaze whenever we worked the busy morning shifts together inside the cramped examination rooms. He knew what I knew about the past. That silent understanding served as its own quiet punishment. I kept my favorite green pen tucked safely in my breast pocket and moved forward into the rest of the day. Grandmother Clara stayed upstairs with her heavy keys. She never asked what happened at the kitchen table. The unwritten household rules demanded a blind eye to certain fractures that threatened the fragile foundation of our work. I gave them that silence without any lingering regret. Some debts were better left uncollected than poisoning the air. The clinic smelled of cold antiseptic and old paper as Astoria woke slowly under a heavy blanket of gray winter fog. I checked the treatment chart for the recovering golden retriever. Every single pill was accounted for in the master log. My hands remained completely steady as I prepared the surgical instruments for the upcoming procedures scheduled before the noon hour. Restraint was not a gift to him at all. It was a necessary gift to my own peace of mind. Letting go of the accumulated anger kept the busy veterinary clinic functioning properly through every single difficult seasonal shift. Lyle could keep his hollow title and his authority. I had the absolute truth locked safely in the floor. That precise knowledge was more than enough to anchor my long working days without ever demanding any public vengeance. The morning sun finally broke through the heavy clouds. A new apprentice walked down the hallway with invoices. I nodded to her and pointed toward the back examination room where our actual daily veterinary work waited for us. The clinic opened its heavy front door to the crisp morning air of Astoria. I walked down the familiar linoleum corridor with my favorite green pen tucked securely into my breast pocket. The metal safety deposit box remained bolted firmly beneath the wooden floorboards in the private back room. Clara sat quietly at the old reception desk with a small stack of unpaid supply invoices sorted carefully by exact date. She did not push them aside or hide the numbers anymore. She handed me the corrected delivery manifest without looking up from her wooden chair. Her fingers did not shake as they used to when sorting through the disputed accounts. She had spent the last 12 years looking past the missing sums to keep the fragile family illusion entirely intact. Now she simply tallied the genuine totals with a borrowed red pencil. Clara managed the morning appointment log by herself, while the first stray cat waited patiently in a metal carrier. I opened the metal storage drawer beside the stainless steel sink to check the surgical inventory. Resting right beneath the spare syringe wrappers was my mother's yellowed recipe card. The faded handwriting listed exact ingredients for sweet bread that she never actually baked during the long winter months. I placed the small paper artifact flat against the surface of the wooden examination table. It stayed there like a quiet marker of everything we had finally survived together in this house. Lau worked 3 benches away without speaking a single unnecessary word to anyone in the room. He quietly cleaned the cold stainless steel instruments and carefully sterilized the heavy surgical trays with slow, methodical care. He did not look at the floor safe or test the lock on my leather ledger. The ledger stayed locked away where no one could alter a single decimal point again. We maintained a professional distance that required no shouting matches across the narrow aisle. The new apprentice walked into the room carrying a fresh stack of treatment charts for the morning operations. I told the young man to check every single dosage twice before entering it into the book. Absolute accuracy mattered far more than speed when an animal depended entirely on your careful and undivided attention. He nodded and took his place by the bright examination light. I picked up my green pen and turned to the first blank page of the week. The ink dried under the bright overhead lamp without a single smudge on the paper. The busy morning appointments began right on time, with exactly 30 minutes allocated for each incoming animal patient. I closed the supply cabinet door and locked the heavy brass latch firmly in place. The clinic operated smoothly under the weight of honest figures and quiet daily routines. Nobody mentioned the past disputes or the missing sums from the ledger. Every person simply did the work that belonged to them. You might wonder why I left the folders untouched in the dark drawer. You might think justice requires a public display. It really does not. Some weights are simply dropped where they stand. Every living creature tells the truth long before any formal record. The physical frame remembers harsh treatment and neglected hours alike. We carry those quiet facts forward without needing an audience. I pulled my wool coat tight against the evening chill. The clinic lights stayed on behind me in the dark. Clara remained safely inside the brick house on Maple Street. I refrained from glancing back at the luminous panes. My boots crunched steadily on the gravel lot. I slowly reached the outer edge of the commercial property and carefully crossed the boundary line into the dark street. That thick timber portal latched closed behind me for the final time. Fresh, cold air filled my lungs completely. I left the brass key hanging on the hook by the frame. My own hands were completely empty.